Kylie Walker. She's the Chief Executive Officer of ATSE, and it's all yours. All yours. Please make it welcome.
Thank you, everybody. I know this is the last session on the second day, and Tanya and I have clearly coordinated colours to keep you wide awake and paying attention. Please stick around. I know that you're probably also tempted to duck out and catch a cab to the airport, but I really implore you to stay here for this high-level wrap to the last couple of days. We've heard here on Gadigal land, and thank you so much for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've appeared throughout our program, and those of you who've joined us in the room and across the conference over the last couple of days, and a particular shout out to our scholarship winners. Thank you so much for being here. But we've heard about some challenges for the next decade, an industrial evolution rather than revolution, the uncertain geopolitical landscape, extreme and unpredictable weather, the skills shortage which is growing daily. It's all sounding pretty dire. We've also heard a lot of cause for hope and for optimism. And I think there's been a real theme of inclusivity, of conversations and collaboration towards problem solving, of bravery and a willingness to step up and step in. There's also been a real theme around working together across different parts of our sector, and with people from different backgrounds to be able to really urgently address those big challenges, to look forward as we're looking backward, to learn from the past as we're building the future. So to bring it all together, just a small job, the two of you, I'm delighted first to introduce Sam Maresh. He's the country leader for GE Australia. He does have a science degree. He's also researched climate policy and has a keen interest in additive manufacturing. But Sam's responsible for driving GE, one of the oldest technology companies in the world, actually. He's responsible for driving the company's growth in Australia and supporting key projects. Sam, would you like to say a few words?
Thanks, Kylie. You really make my STEM credentials. Thank you very much for that acknowledgement of my STEM credentials. Thank you, everyone. Firstly, great to hear the Indigenous voices in this conversation, and I'd like to recognise the Gadigal people on where we're meeting today. When I say to people I work at GE, often they say, well, I've got a GE fridge out the back, it's been fantastic. And what GE does today isn't fridges, we actually do aircraft engines. So if you're jumping on that plane this afternoon, there's a good chance it will be a GE engine. We do precision healthcare, MRI, CT scanners and the like. And we also have an energy business. And I like to call it a decarbonisation business. So everything pretty much except coal. We don't do coal, but we do grid, we do utility scale storage, we do wind farms, we do pump storage, we do digital, you name it, we do it all. I just got back from a week in the United States where I spent the week talking about decarbonisation, the energy transition, and visiting our Global Research Centre where we've got 1,000 researchers in upstate New York, 500 PhD students, solving some of the world's most difficult problems. And it really just emphasised to me, at GE's heart is this STEM capability. And I think it's really a capability for this century that is just so important. So I was really impressed in terms of an organisation and our commitment to STEM. But what I wanted to do very quickly, if the slides come through, I wanted just to talk on some of the key drivers that I saw in this week in the United States around what are the things that are driving our society, our economy, because I think they've radically changed in quite a short period of time. So I'm going to go through this rather quickly because I think we want to get to the conversation. But a couple of points, inflation and interest rates. I know everyone probably watched the budget with great interest on Tuesday night. No? Yes, okay. Yes, of course, excellent. There's some big inflation challenges. You know, when we build a wind farm, that's going to have a big consequence, those inflation. But I think the real issue sitting behind that is inequality and how we may come to terms with some of the structural inequalities in our society, in our communities, and whether or not we can take that high interest, high inflation scenario and actually look for those opportunities. COVID, we all have lived through COVID and come through the other end. Hopefully it's the other end. But really, we wouldn't be sitting here today without the amazing work of science and technology in delivering those vaccines. So it really has re-emphasised to government, to industry, the power of STEM and the power of science and technology. Geopolitical competition, we've all seen it. Regrettably, it's going to happen in our part of the world. Indo-Pacific is going to be the centre for that competition. That has some opportunities in terms of focus, and our part of the world will be, people will be interested in it. Once again, it will have all sorts of consequences. And energy prices, obviously, we're all living that reality. Energy's been weaponised in Russia and the Ukraine. We've got some big challenges there, and hopefully that will drive change in our energy system and a move towards renewables. So they're the drivers. If we look quickly at the global challenges, climate change, I remember sitting in meetings with industry 5 years ago, and there was a acceptance of climate change, but I think that has pivoted within industry. I think people in this room understand the challenges of climate change. They've probably researched them, and it's taken a while for industry to move, but I've got to say I'm of the opinion that shift has happened and there's no going back on it. Energy security, in Australia we've spoken about often the trilemma, the need for reliability, affordability, and sustainability, but energy security now at a global scale is the predominant feature of the system. And the war in Ukraine has pulled a lot of gas out of the planet. We have a global system of energy in this world, and that's been radically disrupted. Emerging technologies. This is just enormous in the United States. US domestic and foreign policy is all about how they capture and harness and they grow these foundational technologies, how they ring-fence them almost, because their great fear is waking up with a strategic competitor having a capability that they don't possess. And finally, food security. Regrettably, conflicts, climate and inflation will have deep consequences for many people on this planet. Just on the emerging technologies, one concept to leave you with, governments have been here about civilising capital, but increasingly I think government's role is about civilising technology, and that has all sorts of consequences and is a really challenging proposition. So let me just end with a couple of thoughts around the new priorities that we're all living with in one way or another. If we can just move to the next slide. There we go. Energy transition. If we think about our grid today, Australia's grid, think about a steam train. It's got 10 carriages. 3 of those carriages might have some electrification. Now, within the decade, we've got to take that steam train and turn it into a Tesla. And the challenge we've got here in Australia is just enormous. We basically have to rebuild our grid, a grid that took 50 years to build. State governments largely built it. In the next decade, we have to actually decarbonise that grid. The great news is the technology's here to do it. The challenge is deployment. So we have the wind technology, we have the solar technology, we have some storage technology. There are some integration challenges, but really it's how do we deploy that technology at scale. Government intervention, I think the role of government we've seen through COVID has been really changed. But one point I wanted to flag with you is a bill that was passed by the US Congress, the Inflation Reduction Act. That act will pump $360 billion over the next 10 years into decarbonising the US economy. A 50% reduction in greenhouse gases, with an aim to have 100% of their generation done by clean energy sources. It is an absolute game changer and really will drive, if you look at our business, onshore wind, in the US over the last decade, they've done about 9 gigawatts of onshore wind every year. They expect that to raise upwards to 15 gigawatts per annum. So in the US, they will be building the Australian grid every couple of years going forward under this legislation. Localisation and high-tech localisation, those foundational technologies are just absolutely key, I think, to all of our futures. Supply chains, globalisation has done a bit of a U-turn. These supply chains are going to be rebuilt in companies like GE. We're looking at them. They're being evolved, they're being changed. Reversing these long-term policies that have prioritised low cost over security, sustainability and resilience. So that has all flipped on its head. And finally, globalisation. It really is a different world from what it was a couple of years ago. You see these partnerships government are entering into, AUKUS, the Quad. They're not only defence relationships, they really are about technology. They're really about, partnerships that go beyond this kind of strategic defence relationship. So there are a couple of observations I had. Very keen to hear people's thoughts and hear their questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. And look, I really admire brevity and clarity in PowerPoint slides. Well done there, thank you. You've set it up very nicely for our next speaker. I think everyone here knows that Professor Tanya Munro is our Chief Defence Scientist. She's also a deeply accomplished physicist. She's a trailblazer in interdisciplinary innovation. She's also a performance cellist. And I think she's probably not going to play an instrument for us today, but Tanya, please come and share your thoughts.
Thanks, Kylie, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here amongst friends, faces new, and those that I'm rediscovering post a lot of screen-to-screen interaction, and really lovely to be back in person. I'll too just briefly acknowledge the wonderful engagement we've had in this event with some really powerful Indigenous thought leaders, and pay my own respects to leaders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that not only are they some of our first scientists and innovators, but just acknowledge the role our Indigenous people have played in the defence of our land and our nation. So as Kylie said, I'm Australia's Chief Defence Scientist and have been in this role 3.5 years. And I guess in my brief comments opening into this, and I'd like to acknowledge Sam's done a beautiful job of setting up some of the sort of global considerations that we grapple with today. In reflecting on what I'd share with you, the two words that spring to mind for me that describe what we need to start to do differently are asymmetry and acceleration. We're living in a world where global strategic deterioration is stark and apparent. You see that every day with news of threats to personal data and some of the really big cyber attacks that have happened recently. And this is a continual battle that we often describe as the sub-threshold or the grey zone, some of which you see, some of which you don't see. In the world of defence and national security, so much of the sort of mindset historically has been on trying to deter war, trying to be able to give our leaders options to respond to conflict in order to be able to prevail and decisively win. We're now in a world where that's rarely possible. And your aim is not necessarily to be able to decisively win, but to be resilient enough to stay in the game. And I put it to you that that is the world in which we now operate. While it's always easier to think of defence in terms of the big shiny platforms and the toys, it's increasingly an information game. You know, we've gone from many people controlling a single platform to a single person controlling many platforms, and we're trying to accelerate how that can give us new capability. But when I also mentioned asymmetry, what I mean by that is, Australia has relatively limited resource and huge territories to defend. How do we do that? Well, I'd argue some of the greatest asymmetry we have is the way we work with our allies and the way we work in the global sense. Sam talked about AUKUS and the Quad and some of these other arrangements. They give us extraordinary resilience, and I have seen a tangible change in the way we work with our allies just over the last couple of years. We've always had deep, trusted partnerships across the Five Eyes and increasingly with countries like South Korea, Japan, and Singapore. But what I'm seeing is a real leaning into enhanced mutual reliance. And, for example, it really is new to see our colleagues in the United States identify extraordinary things we do here in Australia and say they don't need to do that. They'll work with us to make sure that's part of their solutions. That's profound and really important. But noting that I need to be brief, I guess my call to action is this. It's been wonderful hearing the passion, the shared commitment of this community to a range of really important things. First of all, the STEM pipeline. We are poaching from each other. We're eating each other's lunch. We have a serious issue in this nation. And yet, this academy represents some of the change makers and thought leaders who can look at how we can address this fragmentation. How can we change and shape the system? And I put it to you that I think it's about STEM for purpose that can be used to change the conversation. I think if we can change the concept of science, create that concept of a profession of science, because you get to change the world, you get to make a difference on the problems you deeply care about through science. That's the beginning to a different way of working. I'd also argue that when we're under pressure, we can come together and straddle and cross boundaries, and you saw that during COVID. For me, as a relatively fresh public servant after most of my career in the university sector, in the early days of the pandemic, suddenly all the boundaries between different government departments, different agencies fell away, and we were able to do extraordinary things. I put it to you that the crisis we have in terms of our deteriorating international scenario at the moment is a greater one, a more enduring one, and one that will change the world order more, and is that existential crisis that requires us to leave organisational boundaries aside and figure out what we can do more of together. So wonderful to be here, and I look forward to a very animated discussion on how all those elements can come together, because indeed, while I haven't explicitly touched on it here, the theme of diversity and how we just get the best people together to solve those problems is absolutely critical, and hats off to all here who are shifting the dial in that area. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you, and I am going to ask you all to be awake again, please, and to participate by putting up your hand for a question. If you're online, please jump on and submit your questions electronically, and those in the room can also do that as well. Thank you both very much for lifting us up to the global level. I'm going to ask each of you a question, then I'm going to jump back to the audience. Sam, I'd like to know, you're talking about the US building the Australian grid every few years. How are we going to get ahead and work with the global market in the spirit of collaboration, as Tanya has said?
Well, I think we've got an amazing platform here, because we have got a workforce that is highly skilled. We've got our own development pipeline when it comes to renewables, which is tremendous. In this state alone, we're talking about, gigawatts, billions of dollars of new investment. So I think there's an opportunity there and a kind of a base which we can kind of take off from in terms of that relationship. But to Tanya's point, I think these partnerships that are developing, and I suppose at the same time we're seeing, new partnerships forming, traditional trade relationships kind of being torn apart, for want of a better word, depending on who sits in the White House, maybe. But I think those partnerships are really important, and I think they start at a government-to-government level, but I think they quickly draw down into, the relationships that many people in this room have with colleagues in other jurisdictions, other nations, and I think it's how we work that proposition and how we suitably fund it that's important.
Thank you. And look, acknowledging, Tanya, as you've quite rightly pointed out, that everybody here and in the broader STEM sector is really competing for the same small pool of highly skilled workers coming through the education system. What's the role of defence science and technology in leading that change? And I think particularly acknowledging that you are a cluster of organisations, not just one, and you also work out into the private sector.
I think there are a few things to say to that. I think we see ourselves as having the opportunity to, I guess, be a bit bold and try things that I hope get adopted a little bit more widely. So one example I'll give that I know you've heard about at Activate is our Navigate program. And we've got a number of our navigators here with us today. And what this is an experiment. And I'll quickly tell you how it came about, because, I think it's quite an interesting thing to reflect on. In trying to really make sure that we had the right people in Defence Science and Technology Group to deliver on quite a different mission for the organisation than it had historically, I guess I reflected on the fact that the vast majority of the people in the organisation started as graduates. Wonderful, committed, capable people. But how do we profoundly change an organisation so that it's better able to partner with industry and with academe if most of your experience has not been to do that or in those organisations? So what we did with Navigate is created what's like a mid-career grad program where we recognised high potential people, 5 to 15 years from a PhD or equivalent anywhere in industry and universities, or that might have exited doing active STEM, and bring them in and bet on their potential. Give them a development program, give them some rotations in different areas, and not expect them to understand where they might fit in the organisation. So that's been very exciting this year, and I'm really proud of the organisation. I'm really proud of the navigators who've taken that bet that they will find a rewarding career within defence. But I think we've got other ways we can lead here, and I think mobility across our system is absolutely critical. And one thing that became, I guess, a development of the Navigate program was the fact that once our internal staff heard about this development program, this opportunity to essentially rotate around and find their right home, we had an upswell of demand from our own people to be part of it. And so we created a version of a cohort within Navigate for people to go out into the world and learn about other organisations. So I think mobility is part of it. I think backing potential and being willing to support people, not necessarily to reskill, but to immerse themselves in a different environment. I think that's some of what we need to do. And I'm actively out there talking to other organisations who do it differently. I heard an inspiring story the other day from Deloitte's, who have been going out and looking at people working in retail, people who stopped doing STEM at school, and assessing them according to essentially the way they think, and giving them opportunities to train in cyber. I think it's things like that that will change that game of just poaching from our small pool.
And I think potentially a challenge to the fellows and other leaders with us here today in the room and online, that we do have a cultural barrier in Australia to leaving academia to try other things and then coming back into academia to bring that expertise, those networks, that different way of thinking, that different way of interrogating the world, but also to enhance the ability to translate the incredible research that we do here. And I would really love for us to start thinking at that national level, if not the global level, about how we can really improve that, because that's going to open up so many more opportunities, I think, and make it a much more attractive career path to a much broader range of people. Rachel has asked a question that, it's just disappeared. So Rachel would like to know what opportunities or barriers Australia, and I'm going to send this one to you, Sam, Australia has in terms of adopting and developing capabilities in renewable technologies with a particular emphasis on battery storage.
Geez, that's there's a if I can solve that problem in a couple of minutes, I'd be doing very well. Listen, I think that the technology is moving fast, right? And I think about the wind farms that we built 5 years ago they're almost obsolete compared to what we build today. And I think the barriers, there are some gender barriers. And I think what we've seen in the energy sector historically, we don't want to see replicated in the renewable sector. We see a very, very male-dominated workforce with structural issues associated with it. And I think we have the opportunity with the renewable sector to actually make a leap and actually solve those problems before that, because that workforce is going to need to grow exponentially over a period of time. So I think there's some diversity barriers that are there. I think it's a numbers game as well. We just need more engineers, and we're going to need the limitation to Australia succeeding on its energy transition isn't GE. It's not our technology. It's not even the supply chains, although they'll be stretched. It's actually going to be the people. It's going to be the people who will be able to deploy it, the engineers who will be able to design new systems, new grids, new wind farms, the engineers who will be able to actually install them and commission them. So I think there's a diversity question that we've got to get right from the start. There's a question around just upskilling numbers, and I think, I think the optimistic part of this is, I think the pain we're going to go through with high energy prices will just expedite this process. So I think what we've got to make sure we're all focused on is the long-term, well, hopefully the medium-term proposition, which is decarbonising our energy system and putting us on a footing where we can hopefully become a clean energy superpower.
And the urgency of really looking to the full breadth of our brain power has really been a theme over the last couple of days. And I just also wanted to acknowledge that both of you have personally and professionally invested time and money in supporting gender equity in STEM. So thank you very much for that leadership. We have a question in the room.
Thanks, Kylie. George Mulderborough from ATSE New South Wales Division. I heard Sam mention the GE headquarters and lab in upstate New York. And some years ago I had an opportunity to visit that, and I made two comments about that. I do have a question, but the first is, as I walk into the building, I remember there's a desk which was Thomas Edison's desk. Yeah. And the legend is that every electrical engineer at one stage in their life should walk past the desk and give it a bit of a rub. and I did that. But touring the lab, I remember there was a project called the 500 mile project or something to that effect. The idea being to develop a car battery that'll go for 500 miles. So I'd sort of be a bit interested to know where that ended up. But this is not just a self-indulgent reflection. I mean, it's really a segue to ask Sam, how do we get more electrical engineers?
Well, I mean, that's probably a question for firstly, Edison's desk, yes, I was there, and I've got my selfie with Edison's desk. They don't let you touch it, though. It's a bit, which is a bit of a shame. And I can't comment on that specific, that research program, but what I would say is, at the end of the day, this is really about prioritisation. And at the end of the day, governments have got to actually stump up and realise that as a proportion of GDP, we don't invest enough in R&D. I think the focus for industry needs to shift as well, like industry can do better in this space as well. But ultimately, the way you get more people on the ground is invest in the tertiary education sector. And, we've had a false economy to some degree around international students kind of subsidising our research. That was never going to be a sustainable model. So I think that whole tertiary education sector, if we actually believe knowledge is the new currency of the planet, well, let's invest with the knowledge makers, right? It's not rocket science from my perspective.
I'm mindful as well, though, of some of the stories we heard in the panel before about people who didn't even finish high school and have had to sort of get to tertiary education the hard way. Tanya, do you have any insights on that?
Oh, look, I think I'm always just so inspired when I hear those stories of people who found different ways in, but it shouldn't be that hard. We've got to make it easier. There's such talent out there, and we all have different paths in life, and I think actually it'll become a business differential. The companies, the organisations that are able to come up with clever ways to just harness people's passions and talents and make it easier for them to push through whatever barriers life has thrown at them are going to be the ones that thrive into the future. So I'd just say it should be one of those times where constraint drives ingenuity.
Excellent, thank you. Question, please.
Hi, I'm Manju Sharma from the School of Physics, University of Sydney, and I've got two questions. One is to Tanya, both of you, about pouching. So I do physics education research in the School of Physics. And over my career, I've seen so many students who've come in wanting to do honours with me and then become school teachers. But by the time, and they come in first year and that's what they want to do, because they've been inspired by the teachers. I've had chemistry students come in and maths students come in as well in first year about the same thing. But by the time they get to honours or third year, they've actually discovered that there's so much more that can be done. They come back and they say that they will not go into teaching because there's so much more happening. So that's, again, affecting the pipeline and these excited students who could go into, and I don't blame them, I don't blame the system. But again, that's a thing about the undersupply, right? Because it becomes so attractive that they move into other fields when the intention was they would become teachers.
So we don't have very much time. Are you able to get to the question, please?
Yeah. So that's the question. So how do we kind of make teaching more attractive is one of the things.
Okay.
I think we heard some of the key elements earlier today. Get out of the teacher's way, recognise qualifications in field, reward that, all of that. But I actually think that there's room for other disruption. I look at some of the very young, emerging, physics, maths professionals that I know, both in my personal life and in my professional life. And I think, some of them are just gifted natural teachers. I think the notion that you have to be one thing and purely one thing in your life is outdated. And I think we need to look at ways to be able to harness some of that talent in a more flexible way. Perhaps it's a part-time contribution to teaching. Perhaps it's a stint you do or come back to over a career. So I think there's some cleverer career models we can look at. I think our teaching profession is too siloed. And then you see our teachers getting burnt out and frustrated and leaving when they have so much to give.
So unfortunately, we only do have a couple of minutes left, and I can see the questions are flowing in thick and fast. Thank you. I'm hoping that our panellists are willing to stick around and chat for a little bit after the session ends. But I'm going to ask you both to end by responding to a question from Eleanor Huntington, known for her tricky, curly questions. And I'll put it to you first, Sam. Can you please play back for us how Australia is viewed from the outside?
It's a great question. It really is a great question, and it depends on which. I do a lot of work in the region, like literally every night I do work in the region in other time zones. So I think people have their own stereotypes of Australia. I think we're seen as innovators. I think we're seen as people who do have this ideal of equality at some levels, and I think that's a really powerful, those values that I think Australia, is most fond of. I think people recognise them externally. I do, however, see that we're pigeonholed as a high cost proposition, right? And being high cost, I actually want to live in a society where there's high value wages. There's, cost isn't a proposition; it's about productivity. So I think what we need to be able to do is to say, yeah, sure, we're a high-cost economy, but geez, we do things here exceptionally well, whether it be research, whether it be, advanced manufacturing. So I think, to be honest, I think Australia's got a big job to actually sell itself as a place that isn't just a beach, isn't just a quarry, but is a centre of knowledge and capability. And we do punch above our weight. We absolutely punch above our weight. I mean, I can think of some of the visits we've had recently after COVID of our senior executives from GE, and we take them to some of the universities, and they're blown away by some of the research capability here. I think hydrogen and other issues that we're quite interested in. So I think we really need to sell ourselves as not our prowess in sport, well documented. Our prowess in physics and STEM, we probably need to do a better job externally on that and recognise it.
Thank you. Tanya, do you concur?
I do, and I'll just embellish and take it slightly sideways. I am constantly been made to realise by my international counterparts that we often can do things in a much faster, leaner way, sometimes because we have to, the ability to... I'll give you an example. I was in one of our classified labs not that long ago with an international counterpart. They were briefed on something that all I can say to you is it was a bit James Bond-like. And they said, to my researcher, how much did this cost? And I could just tell they were thinking, how many tens of millions did it take you to get to this point? And the researcher looked a bit sheepish and said $20,000. Because sometimes we just have to do things in incredibly lean and innovative way because we are resource constrained. So I think that is one thing that our counterparts, allies, others see us as. But the other thing I'd say is at times, and I think this is quite an interesting dichotomy, seen as quite competitive, as, you know, with
In
regard to
cricket, or-
sport. No, the sort of a national cultural attitude, but at times not confident. We talk ourselves down as a nation. And I am struck by the number of times I have had to have senior people told by others from other nations how bloody good we are. I want to see us become a nation that knows that and cracks after things and doesn't hold back and wait to be told.
There you have it, straight from the mouth of the Chief Defence Scientist. We are bloody good. Please join me, everybody, in thanking Tanya Munro and Sam Marie.
So true.
I'm going to hog the mic for just a moment longer, if you
Please.
don't mind, Nate. I just wanted to acknowledge, given the number of times that the conversation has turned over the last couple of days to the incredible importance of good teaching, I just want to acknowledge and thank all of the teachers who spent time with us here over the last couple of days, both in the room and out in the activation space, really very deliberately and in a very talented way engaging students. We've had students from a range of different high schools here. I'm hoping that you've met some of them, but the teachers have given up their time to come in and engage them in some hands-on STEM activities and invite them into our world and hopefully help them, you know, spark that curiosity and that passion, and maybe one day we might see them back as Fellows of the Academy. So thank you, teachers.